individuals like yourself.
Man, thank you. That's a high honor. I definitely appreciate you. Um, you mentioned also that the settler colonial project that we call America is an example of class collaboration.
Hmm.
And I love this idea, especially whenever you look at the Confederacy and how many of them weren't, they couldn't afford to participate in our enslavement, but just the idea that one day they'll be able to was enough for them to fight for the right to own us as property. If you can you expound on the idea that America is an example of European class collaboration?
Well, you mentioned the Civil War,
Mhm.
1861 to 1865, the so-called Confederate States of America, which of course included North Carolina.
Right.
They seek to break away from the United States because they wanted to perpetuate the enslavement of Africans forevermore. As your comment suggests, a disproportionate percentage of the Euro-American men who are fighting to preserve slavery actually weren't slave owners,
Mhm.
but they thought that the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, if they won that war, would be that they would have the right as well to own enslaved Africans, and that was worth fighting for. However, as my book on the 16th century suggests, if you go back to the first incursion, the first invasion of the English into what they call North Carolina, because even though we talk about Virginia in 1607, actually in the 1580s, there had been an attempt to build a settlement in the coast of what is now North Carolina. And if you look at the class lineup of these folks, they are coming from various class backgrounds.
Mm.
They're shopkeepers, they're poor, they're lumpen elements meaning, prostitutes, thieves, etc., and all sponsored by the 1%. But the 1% in London, that is
Mhm.
the investor class. And that's what I mean by class collaboration. You have people from different classes who are collaborating with one another for a mutual benefit. The mutual benefit being taking the land of the indigenous population, and with a little bit of luck and a lot of pluck, they'd be able to get Africans to work for
Mhm.
free.
Mhm.
Now, what's interesting about this idea of class collaboration is that you cannot begin to understand the United States even today without understanding class collaboration. How else can you understand the Trump coalition?
Right.
74, 75 million strong. It's mathematically imprecise to suggest that in a country of 330 million like this, that only the 1% constitutes 74 to 75 million. That math does not add up. Uh, Obviously, as we all know, there are a considerable number of working class people in the Trump coalition, middle class people in the Trump coalition, and that's the nature of settler colonialism. Because the idea historically has been that there are antagonisms between certain classes. For example, landlords and tenants. Uh, the landlord wants to raise the rent, the tenant wants to keep the rent flat or even have it go down. That's an antagonistic contradiction that leads to a class struggle between landlords and tenants. Likewise, if you're working at a factory, the boss is trying to drive down your wages so he can make more profit. You want your wages to rise so that you can buy toys for your kids and books for your kids, etc. Theoretically, that's an antagonistic contradiction. But what happens under settler colonialism is that the the bosses and the European workers oftentimes collaborate
Right.
because they see a mutual advantage in terms of taking the land from the Native Americans. And this brings me back to what I was talking about a few moments ago, how many of our friends on the left have misinterpreted US history. To give you one example amongst many, I gave you an example of the Jewish question and how it has manifested with regard to the building of settler colonialism, because Jewish people were in on the ground floor with regard to building settler colonialism here in North America, unlike in Spain, where the Catholics engaged in an inquisition with regard to the Jewish people. That is to say, you had to convert to Catholicism or flee, which many of them did, to London, to Turkey, or you're tortured until you say, I'm Catholic, or you're executed.
Right.
Whereas England took a different route, and it said, no, you can get in on the ground floor. And that, of course, leads directly, fast forward to 1947, 1948, when the United States backs the creation of State of Israel, or to 2023, when the United States is still supporting Israeli genocide. Now, our friends on the left, this is the mistake they make. They look at how Jewish people have been treated, say, in Germany, for example, where there was a Holocaust, 6 million people executed, 1941, actually 1933 to 1945. And also you had a similar process unfolding in the Netherlands, in France, in Croatia, in Greece, in Bulgaria, etc. And so they say, oh, okay, United States is a progressive country because unlike in Europe, the Jewish people here were not subjected to a Holocaust. They forget the next step, which is that the Jewish people were in on the ground floor with regard to the expropriation of the indigenous population,
right,
and the enslavement of the Africans. The number 2 official, or number 3 official in the Confederate States of America, Judah Benjamin, J-U-D-A-H, Benjamin, Secretary of State under President Jefferson Davis, the head of the Confederate States of America. He manages to flee. He happens to be Jewish, by the way, which is why I mentioned him. Or if you look at Florida, David Yulee, Y-U-L-E-E, Jewish American, a leading figure in the Sunshine State. And so Jewish people were involved in this project of settler colonialism. That's one of the reasons they weren't subjected to a Holocaust. Now, to be sure, there were bumps along the road because, for example, due south from where you're sitting in Atlanta, you may want to consult and look up the Leo Frank case. He was a Jewish man in Georgia who was lynched because many backwards Euro-American Christians said that he was killing Christian girls so that he could drink their blood, believe it or not, he's a vampire.
Wow.
They lynched him. And what's interesting about the Leo Frank case in particular, and I must say, for your scholars in the audience, an adequate book has yet to be written about this case, is that so Leo Frank tried to blame the killing of the Christian girl circa 1915, Mary Fagan, on the Black janitor.
Wow.
And what's interesting is that the racists, Euro-American Christians, they believe the Black janitor over the Jewish man, interestingly enough.
Wow.
It's very deep. It's very interesting. And what happens with the lynching of Leo Frank, that leads to many affluent Jewish Americans beginning to fund anti-lynching movements because they recognize that they could be lynched too. And that's a step forward in terms of a blow against lynching in this country. But to make a lengthy story shorter, class collaboration has been the essence of this settler state known as the United States of America. Not only do you see it in the Trump coalition, you saw it on January 6, 2020, with the attempt to prevent the peaceful transfer of power and make sure that Trump continues on. If you look at the class lineup of those who were arrested on January 6th, you have people coming in on private planes, for example, CEOs. You have shopkeepers, you have military veterans, you have cops, you have working class people, D-class elements, lumpen elements, once again. And so it's a very diverse class array, almost all of whom were of European descent, needless to say. although there are a couple of Negroes
Yeah.
as well, which is not surprising because I think that going forward to this 2024 election, many Black people understandably are very nervous about what's going to happen. And so many Black people say, maybe I need to cut a deal.
Right, right.
survive, survive this madness, which I totally understand. But we'll see what happens.
What is the underlying purpose of buying power? Like, what is buying power? And you stated it was strategy and marketing and advertising to redirect ad revenue towards commercial media outlets. I thought that was obviously in the book goes into that as well. But if you could, for those who may not have read the book or seen that bill, could you delve into that a little bit more and expound on how that operates in practice?
No, yeah, thank you. And again, yeah, you're right. Shout out to Black Men Build for sure. And I appreciated that chance to build with them. So on the one hand, the popular version of what buying power or spending power or purchasing power is money that people have left over to spend as they see fit, discretionary spending. And it's thought to be an actual number that represents actual dollars. And in some cases, people confuse it with wealth. They confuse it by design. It's intended to be confused. But that's not really what it is in the way that it has been, as I talk about it, weaponized against Black people. So that's where the myth and the propaganda come in. When it's directed at Black people, it's been over the last 150 years turned into this idea that buying power represents some latent, untapped economic strength that Black people squander.
Right.
With some financial illiteracy and ignorance. And that's not what it is. By the way, and it just so happens I watched the movie. I don't know if you or your audience have seen this movie that came out this year, the Killers of the Flower Moon.
It's on my radar. Yeah, I'm definitely going to be watching it soon.
So it's not a spoiler for me to say this, but if you watch the movie, you see a version of this myth developed as it was developed against indigenous people in a way back in the day. This idea that the Osage around the 1920s had come into money. I'll let you all see, you can read see the movie. I'm not gonna spoil it, but the point is, part of the way white folks justified abusing them and taking over their what money they had through political power and public policy, which I'm sure we can come back to, is ultimately what I'm saying we should be struggling for. Was to say that the Osage were financially illiterate. They just didn't know what they were doing. They're immature. They're silly. They're simple-minded. They if we don't take care of their money for them, they're gonna squander it. And of course, that's exactly what Israelis said once upon a time about Palestinians. That's what it's a feature of colonization, is my point. So now we have the most heightened and sophisticated version targeting Black people here, with this idea that Black people are only poor or somehow disadvantaged because they are themselves ignorant and financially illiterate. And that's part of the mythology that is used. So that's what I'm trying to talk about. How did this get developed, popularized, and why have so many over so long a period of time been encouraged to be confused by this? So that's in short what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of interesting, like earlier, right before we got on, I saw President Biden say that right now across America, wages for workers are up and Black wealth is up a record 60% from before the pandemic. And it's like, where do they get these numbers from? And what are these numbers actually what are they supposed to represent? Because we know that when we look at the material conditions of our people, where's that 60% at? You know what I mean? I guess that's more of the myth though, right?
Yeah, and whatever you're referencing, I haven't looked at, so I can't
Mhm.
speak to how they constructed that. But it just doesn't sound like it matches what I have been reading from other people's economic research, whether it's Diedrich Muhammad, Derek Hamilton,
Mhm.
the NCRC, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Economic Policy Institute. I mean, there are all these sources that, I mean, even I was just looking at the wealth division in this country, the wealth breakdown in this country, where 0.1% of this country has 6 times the wealth of the bottom half of the country.
Wow.
So yeah, whatever they're claiming about has happened. And then, but remember, if they're saying 60% since the pandemic of an increase, we're still dealing with the complete erasure of black wealth after the 2008 crash, where most of the black and brown wealth was destroyed in because of the homeowners, the housing value collapse. So, and then by the way, as you just were basically saying, I mean, most of the data is important to study, I think, and to be aware of, but I think most can just look out their window and just look at the lives that they and their families and communities are leading and see, like, come on, man, what are we talking about here? What is this great new day that people are supposed to be experiencing? What I think is more important is to look at the amount of wealth, and this is something I've increasingly wanted to be doing, the amount of wealth being created that is housed in that 0.1%, who by themselves, it was shown, have 12.5% of all the wealth in the country. And the bottom half of the population has only 2.5% of the wealth. So that's so the 0.1, again, 0.1%. And we're talking about almost $200 trillion.
Wow.
And they're saying globally in the next 20 years, I just read the global accumulation of private wealth is going to be just under $700 trillion.
You know where it's going, but whenever you're obviously dealing with technology through a purely capitalist standpoint, without any type of culture that centers the planet and the humans that exist within it, you're going to have these problems. It brings me to my next question. I'm definitely, excited to hear your answer on this. I was in a speech I was reading the other day. It was from Du Bois to the Association of Negro Social Science Teachers. He was talking about, and this was later on, I believe in 1960, closer to the end of his life. Well, he spoke on, while we became more assimilated into American society, we would begin to lose who we are culturally. In 2024, do you think this is where we are as a people, especially considering the growing movements that deny that African Americans are even of African descent?
Yes. But I want to frame it this way. That Homo sapiens, well, nature in general, there's a natural tendency to want to not do work and get the most, outcome out of everything. Everything is trying to fall into an equilibrium. And quiet is kept. Most humans don't want to fight.
Can you expound on that some?
What I mean is that the vast majority of us does not want to constantly come up against resistance.
Yeah.
They want to be able to fall into an equilibrium and not risk, not have a great risk of losing, much of their material living or whatnot, including, of course, their life.
Right.
So that's just a human thing. That's nature in general. That's the whole concept of entropy and, everything, like the smell, like once you hook the bottle or whatnot, and then the smell comes out and it can't go back in, but it tries itself to fill out the space in an equilibrium manner.
Right.
And so there are those of us who have this spirit of, we love to fight. That's what we do. We wake up in the morning, we exercise, we practice, we, do what 42,
52 blocks
for me. That's just what we do. We love it.
Yeah.
But the vast majority of us are not like that.
Right.
So the transatlantic slave Holocaust stripped most African people, of their sense of agency and sovereignty and the like. And we just ultimately want to be left alone to our own devices.
Yeah, right.
And we just want to live comfortably. We don't want no smoke. And, we just gravitate to where the power and the prestige is. And so if the European currently has the power and prestige, then we want to lean there because they already have a system in place that rewards people for assimilating to their culture and ideas.
Right.
And there was, in the beginning, they didn't want that for us. So they did everything in their power to keep us separated from them.
Right.
You can't get into our schools. You can't live into our neighborhoods. You can't even drink out of the same water fountain as we do. And this forced this population of African people to only deal with themselves. So their culture and ideas and everything was built upon us existing and being forced to only live amongst ourselves. So, we couldn't get into their ice cream shop, so we had to start our own. We couldn't get their money, we had to start their own banks.
Right.
We had to start our own construction, ambulance, funeral services, and the like. We had to do things our own way. And so that fostered, a greater sense of business in terms of creativity and identity for African people. But, we always like to compare ourselves to others, and it seems that they are doing better than us, so we need to get access to what they have access to.
Right.
And so what we do is we striving to assimilate into their spaces. And the more and more barriers we broke down, the more and more people wanted to leave and be disassociated with Black folks, because we are the bottom of the tier in the social hierarchy in this country. And so any proximity to whiteness appears, at least in their eyes, guarantees them greater comfort, and prestige. And then, of course, you have these revolutionaries who pop up every generation, fighting against that. Your Malcolms, your Stokely Carmichaels, your Stephen Biko's, and all this other kind of stuff, right? Your Harriet Tubmans, your all these, trying to get more on the self-reliant, and so out of that tradition comes Afrocentricity on the educational front and all this other kind of stuff, right? And so we suffer from this. Their ice water is colder than ours, and we believe the myths that they told us about themselves.
Absolutely.
And so we wanted to be closer to them, and that is what's problematic. And so it's been a long process, but to your question, and specifically in 2024, I think that project of assimilation has, reached a fever pitch to where now when you're talking about Black businesses and self-reliance and agency, they're thinking that you're talking about devil worship or something. Like, is there something in their minds? Like, what do you mean? Like,
right, right.
And you have it even to the point now where, like, I'm noticing, especially among women, like, just scroll down your TikTok page and hear the way that a lot of people are talking. More of us are even talking like, and I just don't understand why we just that. It's not an issue of perfect versus imperfect English or whatnot.
It's imitating. You're imitating someone.
You're imitating like that corporate Karen. Like that's become the standard voice,
right?
And not understanding that your power is in your people and your culture. And so what we have to do is to gain power with an African-centered mindset so that we become the prestige.
Right.
And so for too long, it's just been these people with loud mouths saying but not doing anything, because the people respond to how is your living.
Yeah.
Because for them it's about comfort. Right? Like how does this Black stuff translate into food, clothing, and shelter?
Right.
And good human relations. That's ultimately what they're asking. And so this has to be put more prominently, in the discourse.
Right. The material conditions of the people.
Exactly. And so it don't got to be nothing super deep like, the ancient Egyptians, they with their third eye and the face, the crown head, they had a conversation with Jehuti, and like, no.
It ain't got to do all that, right?
That's not what was going on. That was their, like, ancient Egypt is a perfect example of how relying on your own culture can helps you to prosper, because the ancient Egyptian has the minds of the world, and they try to invade or force anything on you.
Right.
The culture was just so fascinating. The thought was just so fascinating that 2,000 plus years later, after the final temple is closed, we're still talking about them, debating about who they are and what color they are and what this means, and deciphering, having intellectual discussions on Ma'at.
Right.
But it is, so they even have an aesthetic that is grounded in them. And so people are copying their aesthetic.
Right.
So if I may share screen again.
Look, everybody has this opportunity to be a Jay-Z or Beyonce and become billionaires, right? It takes away from those statistics that you mentioned, to where this is not this is an outlier, right? This is not the norm for Black society. And I feel like those type of tropes are often used against us whenever we attempt to show the inequality within all the institutions of this country. They'll point to somebody successful in that field and say, hey, they did it, you can as well, not looking at the systemic factors of how someone may grow up, the conditions of poverty, the conditions of the criminal justice system, all these different conditions to get thrown out of the window, because it's like, look, that one person made it, you can too. And so whenever we are looking at the collective, whenever we are looking at our people and where we want to be, this idea of nothing's wrong. Look at the billionaires in our society that are Black. Look at the millionaires in our society that are Black, and use them as the barometer in which to judge us all. Obviously, is problematic, and I'm pretty sure you've seen it as well. But whenever you do see it, like, what are your thoughts on that?
I feel like it's unfortunate, because on one end, and I wrote one time about this theory of Black excellence, right?
Mm-hmm.
Black excellence is a double-edged sword.
Absolutely.
Because we're celebrating Black excellence because it's important, because it shows that white people are wrong, that their stereotypes are wrong. But at the same time, what it does is it makes it seem that anyone that didn't reach that, it's because of them.
Right.
So that's why, and like one of the structures I'm studying is just world beliefs. And that's another one. When people believe the world is just and they see an injustice, they blame the victim in order to maintain that worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So if we see an Oprah, that doesn't mean every Black woman can do that. And it's not because of a lack of skill or intellect, but we really have to talk about is access to opportunities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And whenever you speak about that access of us having access of opportunity, constantly being denied or constantly having to fight, you know, many different obstacles to make the playing field, you know, fair, right? To make you know, we're always taught as Black people from the time we're young, you got to work extra hard to get where you are. Like we've all heard that from our parents, grandparents, and they were speaking from experience. They were speaking from you know what they know, but this idea that the world is just, there is a propaganda that goes along with that for people, and that enables people to actually believe that. What do you think are some of the ways this society gets people to believe that, hey, this is a just and equitable world, and if you haven't made it, it's your fault?
I think it's some aspects of different parts of the culture. So obviously it comes from this Protestant hard work ethic from off the plantations, like this early idea of American capitalism that's rooted in slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of taught that as soon as slavery ended, they started stereotyping Black people as lazy and saying that if you just work hard, you'll be able to get everything, never wanting to admit that everything they had was built off of the back of enslaved people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all about like cheating in a race and then seeing how much you can maintain in the end of it by lying.
Right.
I think that's the unfortunate part, is a lot of people are really not aware of how racism continues to impact Black people, even Black people. Because even I remember being in elementary school and some kid told me, well, you know, America is a free country. And I kind of just pointed like, what do you mean by that?
Yeah.
You know, what's funny because in the state of Louisiana, there's still an exemption for the 13th Amendment. So everybody's not actually free. You can still enslave someone if they're convicted of a crime in Louisiana.
Absolutely. We'll get to it in a minute, but with Boyce, right? And his response on Willie D's, it's like, is he even aware of any other system outside of this predatory system that we know as capitalism, right? Does he have any, even just a surface knowledge on any alternative? Because, you know, I don't want to get too far into that with Boyce, because we will in a second. But as somebody who is an educator, somebody, you know, professor at Morgan State, the idea that if you study economics, you're only going to study, you know, capitalism and how to, I guess, understand the inner workings of capitalism without any alternatives. Like, I mean, what does that say?
So let me be clear. I don't have an economics degree, so
Sure.
I don't know exactly how. But I've read enough of mainstream discussion of economics as part of my own work to know that there's at least several problems. But I think of it in terms, you know, you mentioned Morgan State. I think, you know, I make this point all the time since my building happens to be right next door. But there is no building for political economy. There's no which is the often associated with Marx's study of the interrelationship of power to the economy and the interrelationship of politics and economics, and as opposed to political science over here and economics over here. But there's an interrelationship, and they are based on power, achieving power. So but they, you know, there's no building or track or school dedicated to Marxists or communists, socialists. There isn't even one overtly dedicated to teaching capitalism either.
Right.
But there is a business school.
Hmm.
There is a business degree. There's a master's in business people can get. I'm not aware of a master's in communism or socialism or that you can get. My point is that what I think is a bigger, or part of the problem is that there is no overt, clear study of capitalism, much less communism.
Right.
I used to use the documentary The Corporation in my classes all the time. And part of what they do in that documentary is ask all of these, you know, economists and business people and Harvard this and Princeton that and Wall Street this, you know, what is a corporation? And all of them on camera struggle to come up with an answer. And I think we have the same problem with capitalism. I don't think most people actually understand what capitalism is, what a capitalist is, the immaterial or social nature of capitalism. In other words, I think it's a mistake to describe it strictly as an economic system. It's an entire colonizing social apparatus.
Right.
And that's why Marx and Engels talked about, you know, we studied money because that's what determines social relationships, not because we want to study economics. My point is, in all of that, is just to simply say that there is no overt and institutional designed effort to teach people anything about how the economy that currently exists works, much less anything else or alternatives. And that's why I often have asked people when they condemn, you know, when you hear the popular references to what people think communism or socialism is, you know, what have you read on it?
Right.
Where are you getting your definition? And very rarely do I hear a response that suggests to me any real attempt to study any of this. So what we get is the propaganda, which created by capitalists for a capitalist economy and a capitalist society. So yeah, it is absolutely possible to get many degrees, all the degrees in economics, and not understand how capitalism works, or certainly have any real understanding of communism or socialism or the histories about any of this. Similarly, you could get an Africana studies, you could be, or a media studies degree, and not be introduced to the radical traditions in those fields either.
Right.
So that's a problem with these institutions to begin with, and why, as part of a segue for you, it doesn't make sense for people to wave around a degree and not wave around their actual work or argument.
Right. All right. Before we go there, because I definitely want to go there, because I have my own criticisms of him even before that. You know what I mean? But for most, all right, within the Africana studies paradigm, right? And you know, obviously, I'm maybe somewhat of an overgeneralization, but within an Africana studies paradigm, would you say that's where most Black folks even, like, I guess, became aware and knowledgeable about alternatives to capitalism through people like, you know, Walter Rodney, C.L.R. James, Paul Robeson, Du Bois, and things of that nature? Would you say that it's been Black studies that has, for the most part, what has introduced us to these ideas of alternative ways of you know, I don't even want to call it a system, but alternative ways of living?
So I think I have to answer. The short answer is no. So institutionalized Black or Africana studies, I think, has not done or been able to sufficiently teach the full range of the Black radical tradition. In fact, you could argue that there has been, within Black studies, an effort to suppress the engagement of African people around the world with communism and Marxism and socialism because it's seen as Eurocentric. And there is that's
interesting.
Yeah. So I think Black Studies has always had this sort of internal struggle with that, and I think at this point, I think it would have to be you would have to conclude that Black Studies has not done the work of teaching people. What has taught people about, to the extent that people do know at all about these histories, is the broader expanse of that Black radical tradition and the activist world and the radical intellectual world, who not only produced some of those figures that you talked about, of course, Du Bois, Robeson, Claudia Jones, and many others. They evolved before what we would now know of as institutionalized Black studies, and we're so it's Black people engaging all forms of radicalism, some of which includes communism and socialism, that has made that. And it's I think, again, unfortunately, Black Studies has not been able to organize itself to institutionalize a proper continual study of those people. So yeah.
I know. One of the ideas also in this book that I appreciated, because it was, the idea when Kanye went on his famous TMZ rant that slavery was a choice, and obviously it made a lot of people angry, and especially coming from someone who admittedly does not read. But you stated that the concept of slavery is a choice is based on the idea that Africans were passive. Can you talk about African rebellion and how Africans were indeed not passive when it came to fighting the institution of slavery?
Well, first of all, a footnote with regard to Ye. His children are half Armenian. Armenian, the Kardashians, of course, are of partial Armenian descent. Armenia was subjected to a genocide, actually about the same time as the Leo Frank case, at the hands of the Turks, liquidated, almost wiped out. I doubt if Ye would say that was a choice.
Right.
The Armenian. Because he's actually visited Armenia when he was married to Kim, for example. So it was a particular insult that he made to his family, and to us. And if he were to be consistent, and if he would say slavery was a choice, Armenian genocide was a choice, at least he'd be consistent.
Right.
No, he's inconsistent.
Right.
Now, with regard to rebelliousness, you cannot understand the history of what's called the Atlantic world. That is to say, North America, the Caribbean, Western Europe, without understanding rebelliousness of Africans. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, 1688, what basically happens is that, to begin with, the African slave trade was under the thumb of the monarch. And so many of the merchants, the merchant class, they feel that that's unfair. They want in on the action because the African slave trade was one of the most lucrative enterprises known to humankind. You can invest $1 and get $1,700 back. I mean, there are those today who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, let alone some African they did not know. So that revolution basically was a revolt of the merchants against the monarch. They clipped the wings of the monarch, leading to what we have today, where King Charles, as he is called, supposedly is ruling the country, and he's very wealthy, but he is not necessarily the most important political figure in 2023, although he was in 1687 up to the Glorious Revolution. So what happens when the merchants enter the slave trade takes off like a rocket, because it's not just one merchant who's trying to monopolize the slave trade. You have numerous merchants who descend upon Africa with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, manacling every African in sight dragging them across the Atlantic, particularly to the Caribbean, Jamaica in particular, Barbados in particular.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens is that the numbers, the ratios favor the Africans. They outnumber the Europeans sometimes at a rate of 10 to 1, 20 to 1. That creates fertile conditions for rebelliousness and revolt. And so what you see is that at that point, you begin to see Europeans making the great trek to the North American mainland.
Mm-hmm.
Historically, South Carolina was a twin of Barbados, for example. And there in the North American mainland, particularly in South Carolina, they could have a more favorable ratio. But that did not necessarily mean the end of slave rebelliousness. You had a rebellion in New York, 1712. As a matter of fact, I've just written a book that'll be published next year.
Oh, wow.
Armed Struggle in 20th century United States. And one of the points of advice that I make to those who might want to consider that enterprise in the 21st century is that if you're really serious, you don't make the mistake of the people in the 20th century, because Quebec, French-speaking Canada, was essential to the revolt of the enslaved in 1712 in New York City. And I dare say that if people want to launch armed struggle, they would not only in the 21st century require the assistance of our Cuban comrades, 90 miles from Florida, they will also need the assistance of our Quebec friends due north of New York City. There was another revolt of the enslaved in New York in 1741. Stoners Revolt in South Carolina, 1739, perhaps the bloodiest revolt in colonial North America. And in fact, the revolt of the Africans leads directly to 1776, wow. Because what happens is that London, the colonial power, decides to raise taxes on the settlers so that they could wage a war against the French in Quebec, who they defeat, and the Spanish in Cuba, who they defeat. Because in the Stoners Revolt 1739, it was assisted by the Spanish in Cuba and Florida.
Right.
For example. Of course, it should not come as a surprise that people who exist upon the free labor of Africans don't want to pay taxes. They don't want taxes today. And so taxes becomes a reason for their revolt against London, setting up the United States of America post 1776. But the revolt of the enslaved continues. Look at the War of 1812, for example. I talk about this in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown. Here you have the British invade Washington, D.C., burn down the White House. The enslaved Africans join the British in doing so, and then escape on British vessels to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. Or look at the Great Dismal Swamp, which incorporates part of North Carolina, north of where you are, to Southern Virginia. There you have African maroons, Black maroons. They'd escaped the entire jurisdiction of the enslavers. And there's evidence to suggest that when you have Nat Turner's slave revolt in Southampton, Virginia, 1831, that the maroons in the Great Dismal Swamp are essential to that process, not to mention the so-called free Negroes who helped the Nat Turner rebels. So, I mean, I could go on in this vein.
Right.
I mean, I think what happens is that people oftentimes talk without knowing what they're talking about.
Like Jordan Peele, Key and Peele, their show does it the best when they have like this magical Negro battle, because they bring it into a comedy realm. But essentially, the magical Negro is like a literary device that white people use in a story, where they want to like infuse some mysticism. They want to help the main character, like in The Matrix. Where, you know what I mean, you're giving this Black man all this power to advise a white person, but never the power to actually do anything. We see this in The Shining. We see this time and time again. So more specific on the trailer. So the whole problem with the magical Negro is I feel like this: if you're giving a Black person the power, it shouldn't be like, but they can only use it to help white people. That's really weird and creepy. And also, it's kind of racist to assume that just because someone's Black, that there's some mysticism there. Like, that's kind of weird, because obviously in a spiritual realm, like, all, you know, whether you believe whatever you believe, but just that overall mysticism does come from this like Southern trope of Black people just being like, oh, they're wise and we'll listen to them and we'll never treat them right. You know. And the Magical Negro Society film trailer, because it comes out in a few months, it's like basically this Black man, they induct him into the Magical Society of Negroes, and we find out disappointingly that he is going to be assigned to a white man with the duty of keeping him happy or satiated. And so it's weird because it's like, well, now you have all this power and your only goal is to keep him satiated. But then they try to make it seem like they do understand what racism is in the movie, because they say, well, we're doing this because white people, when they are unhappy, are very dangerous. And so we're trying to mitigate that danger that white people cause by keeping them satisfied. So in that way, being a magical Negro is almost like a self, like you're sacrificing yourself for the greater good of other Black people in a way, but you're doing it for appeasing white people.
Right. I'm definitely interested in getting your thoughts and opinion on this first question. I heard some recent discussions you were involved in about if the idea of Black Egypt, and many were using the term Afrocentrism. Not you, but many were using the term Afrocentrism as if it means to make ancient cultures Black who were not Black, like a thing of blackwashing, I guess, when it's really an intellectual framework from Malefia Santi that approaches history, culture, politics from an African worldview. Is this something that you've noticed as far as people using Afrocentricity out of context? And what are your thoughts on that whole idea?
Yes, this is something that has been going on for quite some time. And there's a lot of literature that expresses, basically how to combat that and to more properly define what Afrocentricity is, Afrocentrism, and the like. And so what appears to happen, because what people don't understand is that Afrocentricity is a paradigm within the discipline of Africology. And so it is a research paradigm, an approach to analyzing text as well as individuals who write the text concerning issues regarding African people in all spectrums of life. So what the layperson does, who doesn't study Africology as a discipline, what they'll do is say that any and everybody who talks about Black or African people is an Afrocentrist.
Right.
It's almost saying like anybody that works on a car is a physicist,
right?
Is an engineer,
right?
Like there's a difference between someone who is a mechanical engineer versus somebody who changes a flat tire or learns how to switch batteries out. So just because I pop the hood and I replace the spark plugs does not make me a mechanic, let alone a mechanical engineer.
Right.
And so this is what seems to be the case when it comes to any phenomenon that is associated with Black people or African people. And, as soon as you mention African people and Blackness, they try to use Afrocentricity as a euphemism to downplay the analysis of the serious scholars in the field of Africology.
Absolutely. It's like it's almost a pejorative now.
Yes. And we have to do a better job of clarifying, what Afrocentricity is, it as an academic paradigm, how it is used in the evaluation of texts and perspectives, and benefits and issues. And so unfortunately, especially in all fields, have this issue, this underlying issue. We're more familiar with this with people from the physical sciences, like quantum, mechanics and quantum field theory and the like. And so you get these lay persons that have read something and they start talking about quantum consciousness and the double slit theory and nothing appears until you observe it. So like they don't understand because they don't read the particular text, and so they come across something and now they think that what's in their mind is quantum mechanics,
right?
And that is not the case. And so it's a similar thing here with afrocentricity in terms of a research paradigm within the larger field of Africology.
Absolutely. And what are you kind of mentioned it a little bit in your answer, but what are your thoughts on this PR hit that American imperialism is taking with everything that's going on with the genocide in Palestine? Because you see that globally and domestically, people are like, "Yo, this isn't right," and this idea of American exceptionalism seems to be crumbling by the day. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you are absolutely correct. I mean, there's been severe reputational damage for U.S. imperialism because, let's face it, there would have been a resolution in the United Nations calling for a ceasefire, but for the U.S. government vetoing these resolutions. I should also say, for those who say that there should not be Black Americans interested in this conflict, you may not be interested in this conflict, but this conflict is interested in you. What I mean by that is that the Zionist lobby, the Israeli lobby, has sworn to defeat a number of Black American members of Congress who they feel are not necessarily on board with regard to supporting Israel. I'm thinking of Andre Carson of Indiana, who happens to be a Muslim, Summer Lee of Western Pennsylvania, Cori Bush of St. Louis. These are all Black members of the Congressional Black Caucus. Ilhan Omar, who happens to be of Somali origin from Minnesota. So, in other words, instead of Black voters picking your elected representatives, the Zionist lobby says that they're going to pick our elected representatives.
And didn't they try to get Hill Harper to run against Rashida Tlaib?
Yeah, they dangled $20 million
right
before him. And I've been on program previously, and I'm afraid to say that some of the brothers and sisters said they'd offer me $20 million, I would have taken the money and run.
Man, see, see, that's the problem.
So as I said, I mean, this is a very serious conflict, and as we speak, today being December 27th, the conflict continues. Although Israel says that its goal is to destroy Hamas, they have not done so after fighting since October 7th, October 8th. And of course, they suffered numerous casualties. There have also been credible reports about U.S. nationals flooding into Israel to fight on behalf of the Israelis. And in fact, some of the scenes that I've witnessed from Israel and the occupied territories, West Bank in particular, it reminds me of scenes I saw in the latter stages of the overthrow of white supremacy in Rhodesia and apartheid South Africa.
Wow.
Particularly the scene of settlers having rifles slung over their shoulders. That particular image is proliferating coming out of Israel. It could have been Rhodesia or Zimbabwe in 1979. It could have been apartheid South Africa in 1993. So, and I should also mention that one of the most aggressive nations seeking to bring Israel to heel has been South Africa, because there's a long memory in South Africa of Israeli collaboration with the apartheid authorities, up to and including nuclear collaboration,
wow.
By the way. It's no accident that Israel has been dubbed an apartheid state, for example. As a matter of fact, to give you one example of apartheid, imagine you being in Durham, North Carolina, and you had a special license plate that said you couldn't go on, I think, as I recall, it's I-85, for example. But you had to take 40. Well, that's the sort of system of apartheid that exists between Israel and the occupied territories.
Wow.
I mean, we talk about a two-state solution, which I think we may be beyond that. But basically, we have a two-plate solution, two license plates. One license plate, you're on a superhighway. Another license plate, you're on a pock-marked, pothole-ridden road. That's life right now in apartheid Israel.
Wow. The authors have written extensively about why the Civil War was over slavery. Dr. Gerald Horne has even written about the role of slavery in the American Revolution. You have a great article about why it's hard for some to admit that the Civil War was over slavery. Can you build on why some people just refuse to admit this fact?
Well, I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana, and some of the jobs I've worked at here, you'll have coworkers and they'll kind of wear the Confederate flag.
Wow.
And you'll tell them you're offended and they'll be like, oh, it's about heritage. And so, when I was younger, a lot of times I didn't know what to say about that. I just felt like, well, I guess to you it's heritage, but I think it's a horrible heritage it's trying to preserve. But like when I looked at it from a scholarly level, it became like ridiculous. I think some people are unable to accept it as about slavery because that would show that the one time America split in two, it was behind the condition of Black people. And they don't want to accept that Black people's condition is so important to what American is, like to the American project as a whole.
Do you think that the idea that this country was built off of the backs of enslaved people, the idea that the wealth of this country was gained by this institution of slavery, do you think that is possibly one of the reasons why they like to deny the historical truth of what the Civil War is about?
Absolutely. It's well known that people would use enslaved people as collateral for bank loans and for property. So my second great grandmother on my father's side was enslaved, and she was listed as property in an estate along with her children. So that's just an example of, Black people were used as collateral. So when slavery was abolished after the Civil War, it made a lot of Southerners instantly broke because not only did some of their lands were confiscated, but their actual human property was confiscated. And as a result, they lost that as a wealth. So yeah, the money that America has and that became America is from off the backs of enslaved people. The White House was built in part of enslaved people's labor. So it's really hard to say you care about America and just don't care about Black people's history. But a lot of people, it just makes them feel very uncomfortable.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And and you mentioned the Confederate flag. I was riding through South Carolina a few months ago, and I forgot what city I was in, but there was a huge American flag on the freeway, and I think it was put up by the Daughters of Confederacy. And this whole idea of this is our heritage. What do you think they're actually trying to say there? Because when we look at what this quote unquote heritage means to us, right? It means enslavement, it means oppression, it means Jim Crow, it means all of these things that have been used to keep us in a fixed position in the social hierarchy of America. Whenever they say it, they tend to kind of veil it as if, oh no, we're just celebrating our family history. But I think we know that it's more than that. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, it's basically their heritage is inseparable from the history of slavery. That's the part that they're unwilling to acknowledge. So yes, the Southern culture, the way we cook, the things we celebrate, the way we dress, the politeness that we supposedly have. All of these are relics of slavery, but they kind of take a colorblind racism approach to it. So by that, they're just like, oh no, we just loved everything else. Like we loved the sweet tea. We didn't care about the slavery. And it's like when we realized that the reason why you were able to enjoy that sweet tea is because in Louisiana and Florida, they had sugar slavery. So, you know, you can't separate their pleasures from the discomfort of others. And that's what we talk about in the modern era when we talk about white privilege and how it was created in chattel slavery, how it was maintained in Jim Crow, and maintained in the post-civil rights era through like a colorblind racism.
Absolutely.
But well, and that's the one thing I actually don't think it's crazy. And that's one thing I've really come to appreciate after spending the time doing this research and some other work. It is that and being even just in media studies, because I have learned I just have a different appreciation now for the effort and the sophistication of the psychological warfare that we're suffering.
Right.
So I'm not trying to excuse us all for our bad decisions, but I am trying to be a little more understanding or objective and trying to really to have an analysis that, yeah, we should do better with what, you know, our decisions. Yes, we could do this. Yes, we could do that. But the reality is, ultimately, billions of dollars and decades of intense study and research has gone into and continues to go into studying how to manipulate most of us, how to create narratives, how to create a media and digital environment of messaging and that's ultimately what I've been trying to show with my book, is that what we end up seeing is that what we think, because we see Black people having the conversation, we think that what we're hearing is actually a Black analysis. And what we're hearing are very white, conservative, capitalist, reactionary, colonizing, psychological warfare, implanted messages being delivered through Black spaces. And it's been encouraged. So it's not crazy to me that even when it becomes frustrating in the way that some people react to me personally, I do try to remember that what they're responding to has been something that has been literally constructed by the most powerful and wealthy sectors of the society for a long time. I mean, that's really what mass communication research in the field of communication studies was developed to do. To organize the study and research into manipulating public opinion. And today they talk about it in terms of cognitive infrastructure, the development of how we think. And we are largely unaware of the forces that are involved and the resources and the ways that we're manipulated. It's very sophisticated, and no society in the world has ever suffered what we're suffering right now here in the United States. It's you know, my contradiction is it's a beautiful system. I mean, it really is remarkable if you really start to think about how that 0.1% manipulate the narrative. And it's not some mystical conspiracy. It's organized, funded, concerned research that's doing this. They're concerned. I'll stop here, but if people are paying attention or maybe they caught it, maybe you and your audience have caught this already, but Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the Anti-Defamation League, was caught on tape telling his audience that he was trying to fundraise from. He said, look, Israel is losing. He said, in fact, he said it 3 times. We have a major crisis of narrative, because most young people, he was saying, even young Jews don't agree with Israel at this point. And he's saying, we got to raise money and get more people. They were talking about funding people on TikTok to promote Israel. They were talking about getting, raising hundreds of millions of dollars to create new propaganda campaigns. So that's just this one new effort.
Right.
This is something that has been orchestrated by the military in this country, by the political elite in this country, by the ruling elite for a very long time. So I'm sympathetic, at least,
Oh, for sure.
or to why we end up being fooled by it, myself included.